Foundation videos.
Cross-Stitch Basics with Special Agent Jacqui Empson Laporte.
My mom taught me how to cross stitch, and I'm here today to show you a few of the basics and to show you that it's a really fun activity that you can do, and there's an amazing range of projects that you can do that will interest you. So I hope that you find this interesting, and I hope that I can encourage you to take up this amazing activity. So I am going to show you the basics today, and I'll show you all of the materials that you need to start. Again, you can get most of these things locally. I go to the Made in Huron store, and there might be a couple other places in Goderich. I'll tell you about the fabric. So the kind of fabric that I use is called Ada cloth, and there are other kinds, but I'm not as familiar with those. I'll tell you about where I get my patterns, and where there's lots of sources for patterns for all different kinds of sewers, different ages of sewers. And I'll give you some tips to make things a lot easier, because I wish I would have known some of these tips years ago, and I wouldn't have made some of the mistakes that I made. And then finally, I'll tell you how to actually stitch. And the beauty of cross stitch is that it's really just X's, and it's always the same stitch. It just matters how many X's that you have to put in and how many different colors. That's the complexity. So I'll go over all this kind of stuff, and I hope that you stick with me. Thanks. So the first thing that you do is you collect the materials that you're going to need. So there's a couple of different frames. So this is a frame that's in the circle there. And what you do is it comes in two pieces, and you put your fabric on it, then put on the outer ring, and what that does is it holds your fabric really nice and tight where you're sewing. And you'll sew with loose fabric once or twice, and you'll realize how nice it is to stitch when it's held very tight, especially when you're doing very small stitches. So they come in many different sizes. They also come in wooden, but I find these plastic ones a little bit more durable. And like I said, you can get any of these frames at your local craft store in your town. The other kind of frame is called a Q-snap, and again, they come also in different sizes as well. And they are a square frame, and what they do is they have this, you put the fabric on, and then this piece snaps onto each corner or each side, and it holds the fabric in place. I prefer these ones because they give me a little bit more working space to do my stitching, because I tend to stitch in many different places all at once. And they package up real nice and tight too, because they come apart into sections. So I like those. The thread that you'll find at most craft stores is either DMC or Anchor. That's the name brand of them. But basically you're looking for cotton threads that have different strands, and DMC is what's used in most patterns, but there's lots of converters online where you can convert one color to another color in a different company. DMC and all of them come as numbered colors, not color, the name, so you always look for the number of the color that you want. I buy these little plastic bobbins. They come in cardboard too, but I find the plastic ones a little bit more durable. And I buy the thread, I wrap it around these little bobbins, and then I write the number on the bobbin so that I have it. Needles, you can get different size needles, And what I would recommend is that you find one that kind of suits. I use a size 28 needle, and they tend to have, for cross stitch, a dull end. So it's not sharp. And the reason is that for that is because most of the time in cross stitch, you're going through a hole, an existing hole in the fabric of the material. You're not making a new hole like you would do with normal sewing. And in terms of patterns, this is where you can get really artistic. You could just go to the store and buy whatever thread that you wanted, whatever color really spoke to you and resonated with you, and you don't necessarily have to do a pattern. You can just put down as many colors as you want in sort of a mandala, abstract kind of shape if you wanted. So you can buy a pattern or you don't really have to. It's up to you. So Aida cloth is sold by something called the count, and the count refers to the number of stitches in 1 inch of the fabric. So it'll say on the packaging what kind of count it is, but if you're ever unsure, if you find some Aida cloth at the thrift shop, which is always my favorite spot to find some, what you do is you measure 1 inch with a ruler and then count the number of stitches in that inch, and that'll tell you the count. Some typical Aida fabric that you can find is 14 count or 18 or 22. And I predominantly use 18 and 22. They're just my favorites that I'm used to. Here are some examples of patterns that you can find, and I just wanted to show you the array of patterns that you can get from quite simple. So the Christmas lights at the bottom there, that would be a very simple pattern to do with very simple colors. The rub-a-dub-dub tub would be a more traditional sort of pattern that you could do. And then there's some very, very beautiful patterns with lots of different colors. The owl pattern there at the top is actually a pattern that only has 10 different colors in it. And it's just the shading that gives you the detail. Again, all of these are done using the same stitch, the same cross stitch, and just the variety of patterns that you can find are amazing. You can find some patterns on Etsy and Pinterest, those kinds of shops like that. The butterfly and the owls come from some different pattern companies online, Artisy and Heaven and Earth Designs. Again, you can just search for cross stitch patterns and find them. The only recommendation I would have is to maybe hold off buying patterns off of eBay or Amazon. eBay in particular, sometimes they're copyright violations of patterns, and we really want to make sure that the patterns are purchased from the artist or the designer that has licensed the pattern. So try for either original designs on Etsy by the artists themselves or from reputable companies online. So I just want to show you a little bit about the patterns, some basic tips and tricks. And this is basically applies to any pattern that you get, from a simple pattern off of Etsy from the designer to one that you purchase, or even a kit. A company called Dimensions sells kits, and in it you get all of the fabric, all of the thread, and the pattern itself. So on every pattern there is a legend. And so you can see that on the top left picture there. And the legend is very simple. It's just like a map. There'll be a symbol, and that symbol correlates to all of the stitches that have that color. So in the one that I've circled on the example there, the black diamond is DMC 150. 150 is the color. It's a dusty rose color. And every time you see that black diamond on your pattern, you will use that color. The strands it says 2 there, so it says 2 for all of the colors there. Some patterns are different, but most of them are 2. And so what that means is every time you use that color, you're using 2 strands. And I've included an image at the bottom there. That is what a typical DMC or anchor thread comes in. And you'll see the section that's pulled out. And when it's separated, you'll see that there's 6 strands in that. So what you do is you take a stretch of the thread, cut it so that you have a length of that thread, and then in that length that you've cut, you separate out the strands and you take 2 of those strands, and that's what you're going to use for your stitching. I hope I made that clear. So I think all of us have tried this at school at some point, or we get those puzzle books from the variety store, and they have a thing where they have a picture with a grid on it, and then you use the grid to replicate that picture. So it's very similar to the image of the dog at the top, where you have a blank grid, and if you wanted to copy how to draw that dog, you would look at each square and then copy what was in that square. So cross stitch is very same in counted cross stitch. So on the left hand side of the picture, I show you an empty grid, and that would be very similar to the fabric that I showed you, the Aida cloth with the holes in it. And on the right, I've showed you my pattern, which is the word will. And you can see I have some symbols there, so I would check my legend to see what color of thread I was supposed to use for that symbol. And then when I went back to my fabric, I would recreate the word will in the pattern shape, counting the same as I would if I was on the dog. So you're looking at your fabric, and then you're looking at the pattern, and then back to your fabric. So there's basically really one rule of cross stitch, and it's always that you do your stitches the same way. And it doesn't matter if you do your stitching up and down or sideways or on an angle or by row or by color, but you should always do the stitches the same way. So what I mean by that is cross stitch is an X, and so you're always going to do your stitches in the same way, so that the first stitch is going in this direction and the second stitch is going in that direction, and that's what makes the X. What that does is it means that the fabric or the thread that's at the top of the stitch is always going in the same direction, and you wouldn't think that it makes such a big difference, but it does add a bit of texture or smoothness to the picture when you do it in this way. So doing the stitches in the same way is probably the main rule that I've seen every cross stitcher do, but how those stitches to get to be in that way varies. It just people tend to stitch whatever makes them happy. I stitch what is called cross country, and that means over an entire pattern I do the same color. So I do all of the stitches of one color, and then I start on the stitches of another color. I promise to share with you some tips that I've learned from some cross stitch groups over the years, and these are the 2 main tips that have helped me so much. So the picture in the middle is actually a snippet from a pattern that I have, and you'll see there's some squares there, and you'll see the 30 and the 40. That's just the size of the pattern that I was using, and you'll see the different symbols there. So remember what I said before, is that each symbol on the pattern pertains to a different color, and you refer back to the legend to know what that means. But my fabric was blank, and a lot of people get really concerned about, well, what if I don't count properly, or what if I put in an extra stitch? So one thing that you can do that I found really helps is it's called gridding. And you can see that picture on the very left. And what I've done is I've taken a fabric pencil. It's washable, so it washes out in the wash. And I've drawn grid lines on my fabric to make blocks of 10. And the reason I did blocks of 10 is because my pattern also has blocks of 10. So you can see the outer line that forms the block. And in that way, it's a lot easier for me to count when I'm doing my stitches, because I can look very quickly to the block on the pattern and then very quickly to the block on my fabric. So I just find that very helpful. And the second little tip is called highlighting, or there's an electronic version, an app called Pattern Keeper that also does this. And what I do on a paper pattern is on the picture in the middle, what I do is I highlight stitches that I want to do in yellow, and then when I'm finished I highlight it in blue, and that helps me keep track of what stitches that I finished. And then when I look from the pattern onto my fabric, it looks very much the same because the stitches are finished. So I hope I've explained that. Pattern Keeper is a is an app that you can get, and it's just a touch screen, and when I touch the pattern, it colors up the symbols for me. So it does the same as a highlighter and on a paper pattern, but it makes things a little bit more simple. The final tip is called a loop start, and this is basically how somebody starts their fabric when they're using 2 strands to do a pattern. So if you remember the example that I showed you before, it said the pattern called for 2 strands of a color 105. And what this means is you take, when you separate out the 6 strands from the DMC, you separate out one, you fold it in half. So I don't know if you can see this, but I'm going to fold it in half like this. And when I fold it in half, it gives me a loop. And I put this in my needle and I start at the bottom of my fabric. So I'm going to come up with my needle from the top and then go down, just like in that picture on the top right. But before I pull the needle all the way through, I'm going to put it through my loop. And what that does when I pull it tight is that loop goes right up into the fabric, and then I don't have to knot it. And the benefit of me not having to knot it is it doesn't make my fabric all bumpy when I'm done my project, because you could end up with a lot of knots at the back of your pattern when you're finished, and it just makes the back a little bit less messy. There are people who are really good at stitching and really good at making the backs look very neat and tidy. True confession here, the backs of my projects are a hot mess, and I worry more about what the front looks like rather than the back, because I feel like the back is going to get framed and be covered up by the frame, or it's going to go into a pillow and nobody's going to see it anyway. It's just something that I choose not to get really stressed about. However, if you're if you like things neat and tidy and that's the way you prefer to operate, all the power to you. This loop start is a great way to help keep the backs neat and tidy. There's some other ways to stitch too, but basically, it's really important just to start and to try. So my final tips that I want to provide to you is always pick a pattern that you love, because it's going to take you a bit of time to do it. And if you don't really love it or it doesn't speak to you at all, it's going to be a pretty tough slog. It's going to be like that homework in that subject that you don't really like, compared to the homework in the subject that you really love. So pick a pattern that you love or has a message that you really like, and it'll make it a lot easier to stick with it. Some of my patterns take me a long time. The butterfly pattern or the owl will take me a good 6 months to work on it, depending on how much stitches I do in a day. And so again, when you're going to spend that much time on it, you really want to make sure that it's something that you want to invest your time in. If a stitch doesn't look right, you can always take it out carefully with a seam ripper. So just don't stress about mistakes and counting. I think counted cross stitch, that's what people get most upset about or most frustrated with, that they've made a mistake. I'll give you a little tip. I've been stitching for 30 years or more, and I probably have never finished a pattern that didn't have a mistake or two in it. And I have just learned to, work around it and add my own little artistic flair. So sometimes if I make a mistake, I just have to add a few more stitches around it to make it look good. Or sometimes I just kind of make it work. The most important thing is that you just enjoy it and it doesn't cause anxiety for you, and you just enjoy the motions of the stitching, and you enjoy the art that comes out of you putting all your stitches together. The other tip, which I think people find a little bit surprising, is that patterns with more stitches aren't more complicated. They just have a lot more X's that you have to do in the pattern to get the picture to come out. And I find that they can actually be a little bit more forgiving. So the butterfly, the monarch on the sunflower, has about 45 different colors in it, and a lot of them are yellow and orange. And I say that it's a little more forgiving because if I put the wrong color of orange somewhere, probably doesn't matter. Nobody's going to know it. And if I'm off 1 or 2 stitches, probably doesn't matter, again, because there's so many of them. Whereas if you go to a more simple pattern, sometimes that can make a big difference because it changes the shape of a word or it changes the shape of a heart. So just because something has more stitches, don't be afraid to tackle it. It is going to take you a little bit more time, but sometimes they can be a little bit easier actually because you can hide your mistakes a little bit easier. So I hope I've encouraged you to try. If anybody has any questions, they can absolutely get in touch with me, and I would love to see more young people get involved in this, this art. Thanks.